Drumadine Village, page 262, volume 5, chapter 5, number 3. The night passed silently and uneventfully, but the next morning at daybreak, a group of strangers appeared in Ding Village. A dozen or so stout, strong men from neighboring villages, all between the ages of 30 and 40, with years of experience digging foundation and constructing tombs. They arrived with an elderly man whom the villagers later learned was a 70-year-old master engraver. It took them 1 day and 1 night to dig Ling Ling and Uncle's grave. In our family plot, southwest of the village, they dug an open trench next to my mother's grave, cut an entrance into one side, and proceeded to hollow out a large underground burial chamber. It was as spacious as a small house, vastly bigger than a typical grave. By then, the fever had swept across the plain, and people were dying in droves, dropping like autumn leaves. With so many bodies to bury, graves had shrunk to about half their former size. But Uncle's was a king-sized grave, a tomb built for two, and it dwarfed even the his and hers graves that people had dug before the fever. Uncle's tomb was bigger, a lot bigger. More important than the size of the tomb was the care that went into its construction. Working with a knife, shovel, and miniature spade, the elderly engraver covered one wall of the tomb with an elaborately carved map of Dongjing, the capital city of the ancient Song dynasty, now the modern city of Kaifeng. His depiction of Dongjing's famed pavilions and pagodas, gardens and lakes, temples and ancestral halls was like a painting in the palace of an emperor. It lent the tomb a classical air, a whiff of elegancy and antiquity. On the opposite wall, he engraved a landscape of modern-day Kaifeng that included high-rises and landmark buildings, fountains and public squares, the City Hall and Municipal Communist Party Committee offices, thriving commercial districts and crowded shopping streets lined with vendors' booths. Bold calligraphy above the classical landscape identified it as Song Dynasty capital. The modern depiction was entitled New Kaifeng. Although the landscapes were a bit rough, not as fine as if they'd been painted on a scroll, say, they were still an artistic marvel, a rarity in these parts. It was as if all the wonders under the sun had converged on Ding Village to live in vivid detail on the walls of a tomb. The news spread quickly through the village, and people began flocking to see it. They came in droves. They arrived in groups, like travelers on a package tour. Everyone who climbed into the tomb emerged singing its praises. What exquisite craftsmanship! What elaborate carvings! What lifelike detail! The dragons and phoenixes on the dragon pavilion, so real that you could reach out and touch them, and the crowds of people, as if you could hear their voices. As the wondrous tales passed from person to person and spread through the village, the tomb drew even more curiosity seekers. Young and old alike came to gawp at Uncle and Ling Ling's grave. It was as if an imperial palace had suddenly sprung from the soil, or a long-lost city been unearthed on the plain. The day that Uncle and Ling Ling were to be buried, people flocked to their grave like sightseers at an imperial tube. It was just after sunrise, and the eastern horizon was a crimson lake, a sea of fire. The fields were brilliant with light, and shining golden stalks of wheat that now stood nearly knee-high. Around the fields there were clumps of grass and shades ranging from jade green to dull yellow. Uncle and Ling Ling's twin grave was located at the far end of our family's plot. 2 mounds of soil stood on either side of the trench, marking the entrance to their tomb. Even though the feet of many visitors had trampled the earth, the smell of freshly turned soil was still thick and fragrant in the air. Villagers climbed down into the trench and emerged chattering and clicking their tongues in amazement. When others emerged from the trench after inspecting the tomb, they would ask, "Can you believe it?" And the newcomer would say something like, "It's almost worth dying for," or, "I wish someone would build me a tomb like that," or, "If I could be buried in there, I'd take the fever 100 times over." Soon the men who were helping to bury Jia Genbo and Ding Yuju arrived to see the tomb. They were Ding Village's most experienced excavators, gravediggers, and bricklayers. The other villagers made way for them so that they could see for themselves. As they descended into the tomb, the men seemed skeptical, but they emerged smiling and thoroughly convinced. One of them, a middle-aged gravedigger, asked the young man who was sitting outside the tomb guarding the tools, "Did you do these carvings?" "No, my uncle did." "Where do you learn to carve like that?" "It's a family tradition." "You think he'd be willing to do some carvings in the 2 graves we're digging?" "This is an imperial-style tomb," the young man answered. "Back in the old days, you'd have to be an official of the 4th rank to get a tomb like this. Of course, nowadays things are different, but even my uncle still needs permission from the higher-ups to do these carvings. Without a signed and sealed order from a government official, he can't do it. You can't go around carving this stuff on any old tomb. So how did Ding Liang manage it? His brother Ding Hui is chairman of the county task force. That ended the conversation. The local craftsmen and gravediggers went back to the village. It was nearly time for the other villagers, who had promised to help bury Genbo and Juju, to begin preparing the bodies and placing them in the coffins that waited outside their family's front gates. The two coffins had been constructed some time before, after the big tree felling. Both were made of 4-inch thick planks of paulownia wood, with 3-inch thick planks of cedar on either end. The ends of the caskets, engraved with large funeral ideographs, touched up with gold or silver paint, glittered like metallic flowers. The coffins were nice enough, but the graves Jia Genzu and Ding Yujin had dug for their younger brothers were nothing compared to the tomb my father had built for his younger brother. Uncle's was an imperial-style tomb, befitting a high-ranking official, and my father had filled it with engravings of Kei Feng's glorious past and present, so that Uncle might be laid to rest in the company of that inspiring scenery. Jia Genzu and Ding Yujin thought the only pity was that the village adulterers should occupy such an elaborate tomb. They couldn't help but take it personally, as a loss of face. Fortunately, their younger brothers had fine coffins, the sort usually reserved for the oldest and most venerable villagers. The sort of coffins usually afforded only by well-to-do families with a certain amount of power and influence, caskets that reflected the wealth and status of their occupants, or their occupants' relatives. The two families lived on the same lane, just a few doors away from each other. As the villagers milled around the coffins at the two front gate, they talked about how nice the caskets looked, and how Jia Genzu and Ding Yujin had done their brothers proud, and although their graves weren't nearly as fancy as the one Ding Hui had built for his brother, wasn't it nice that they'd managed to come up with two such lovely coffins? In that instance, two trucks drove into the village and parked in front of Uncle's house. Each truck contained a coffin wrapped in several layers of cloth and heavy paper. When the coffins had been unloaded, they were placed on long wooden benches and carefully unwrapped. By now, the trucks had attracted a crowd of curious villagers. They clustered around Uncle's front gate, eager to get a look at the coffins. What they saw were a pair of his and her caskets. Both were made of ginkgo, an extremely rare and expensive timber. With the spread of the fever, death had become commonplace on the plain. People died like falling leaves, like lamps being extinguished. Timber was in short supply, and the dead needed coffins as badly as the living needed houses. Paulownia trees were as scarce as silver, and cedar was as precious as gold. But the coffins my father had delivered were not made from paulownia or cedar, but from the finest ginkgo. Uncle's coffin was slightly larger, and it even had a name, the Golden Casket. It was made from 3-inch thick planks cut from a 1,000-year-old ginkgo tree. The grain was flawless, the wood soft to the touch but very solid, perfect for carving or painting on. With the exception of the base of the coffin, the side that would rest against the soil, every surface was engraved with extravagant scenes and famous landscapes. There were classical landscapes with mountains, rivers, and heavenly clouds, big city scenes with broad avenues and narrow streets, streams of cars and pedestrians, bridges and interchanges that looped like intestines. There were tree-filled parks peopled with tiny figures flying kites or boating on lakes. In the past, his and her coffins had been engraved with classical scenes, such as images of piety from the 24 filial exemplars, the legend of Meng Jiangzu, the loyal wife who cried down a section of the Great Wall while mourning her husband, and the legend of Liang and Zhu, the butterfly lovers, a Chinese Romeo and Juliet. But the engravings on Uncle and Ling Ling's caskets were mostly big city scenes depicting famous landmarks: Beijing's Tiananmen Square, Shanghai's Oriental Pearl Television Tower, Guangzhou's high-rise hotels, and various buildings, commercial districts, department stores, suspension bridges, fountains, parks, and public squares. Needless to say, whoever had done the engravings must have been well-traveled in order to depict these cosmopolitan scenes so realistically. He had brought to life the wealth and splendor, the bustle and excitement of the modern Chinese metropolises of Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou. Every scene was in vivid colors, highlighted with red, gold, and silver paint. The villagers crowded around the coffins, gasping at their splendor. "Good heavens!" exclaimed one woman. "Can you believe this thing? I'll bet even emperors never got caskets this nice." Gingerly, she reached out to touch the engravings. "Come here, you've got to feel this. It's smoother than a baby's bottom." The villagers clustered around, touching the engravings and running their fingers over miniature high-rises, overpasses crowded with cars, street lamps lining public squares, and people sitting beside lakes. Another woman, noticing that the cover of the casket was ajar, peeked inside and saw that the interior was also engraved. Gingerly, she raised the lid, revealing more engravings and a large photograph of Ding Liang pasted at the head of the casket. The engravings presented an idyllic portrait of big city life. A flat with refrigerator, washing machine, television set, home entertainment center, microphone, speakers, and karaoke machine. A sumptuous banquet waited on a table, mouth-watering platters of chicken and duck, meat and fish, bottles of expensive wine, cups and wine glasses, and festive red chopsticks. There were high-rises and office buildings, cinemas and theaters, all clearly the property of the Ding clan. Signs over the entrances to the building read Ding Family Theater, Ding Family Cinema, and Ding Family Towers. Even the appliances and electronics were labeled with Ding Liang's name. But perhaps most important of all was the building engraved at the foot of Uncle's coffin. A sign above the entrance to the building identified it as the People's Bank of China. In this way, the accumulated wealth of an entire nation, the fruit of decades of Chinese economic development, would accompany Uncle into the afterlife. All the power and glory and prosperity of the world stuffed into one casket. The villagers turned to Ling Ling's coffin. Although her silver casket was a shade smaller than Uncle's, it was made from the same material, the rare and expensive timber of the ginkgo tree, and the exterior was engraved with the same big city scenes. Inside, at the head of the casket, was a photograph of Ling Ling smiling. Engravings on the inside of the casket showed silks and satins, clothing and jewelry, dressing tables, makeup boxes, and other feminine items. There was also a handy assortment of kitchen items that no woman should be without. Sideboards filled with bowls and plates, cups and glasses, modern cooking ranges with exhaust fans, aprons, and bamboo steamers. There were potted plants and flowering bushes, grapevines, and a pomegranate tree, a symbol of fertility. The engraving even included a miniature Ling Ling, hanging Uncle's freshly washed shirts and trousers to dry under the pomegranate tree. As the villagers were marveling over Ling Ling and Uncle's coffins, Grandpa emerged from Uncle's house, beaming and looking years younger than he had just a few days before. "Professor Ding, these coffins are incredible," said one villager. "Liang and Ling Ling are very lucky." "I don't know about lucky," Grandpa said, standing beside the coffins, "but at least they will be buried with respect." "What kind of coffins are these?" asked another. "The old-timers used to call them gold and silver caskets, but these are more modern versions. You probably noticed all the city scenes." It was nearly time to place the bodies in the caskets. With the exception of Jia Genzu and Ding Yujin, everyone in the village seemed to be gathered outside Uncle's house. Ding Yujin's own mother was there, as were Jia Genzu's wife and son. Crowds of people, some from neighboring villages, milled outside the house and overflowed into the streets. The atmosphere was lively, as if Ding Village were putting on a performance and everyone had come to see it. There was a crowd of laughing, chattering, jostling people. Men and women, elderly folk and children, locals and visitors. Some of the kids were perched in trees or on the tops of brick walls, as if they were waiting for the show to begin. The sun had risen and was nearly overhead. Bright streaks of sunshine animated the crowd, turning a mournful event into a celebration, turning a funeral into a public performance. My father was still at our house, talking to the men who had delivered the caskets from the city. My mother was at Uncle's house, serving tea and passing out cigarettes to out-of-town guests who had come for the funeral. My little sister was running around in the crowd, squeezing through a forest of adult legs and generally getting underfoot. At last my father set out for Uncle's house, trailed by a crowd of locals and visitors from the city and surrounding villages. When the mob outside Uncle's gate saw him approaching, someone shouted, "Are you going to put the bodies in the coffins?" "Yes," my father answered. "It's time." The time had come to dress the bodies and place them in their coffins with the items they would be buried with. Brand-name liquor and cigarettes for Uncle, and a change of clothes and costume jewelry that looked just like the real thing for Ling Ling. As the villagers surged into the house, eager to help carry the bodies and funeral items, my father noticed that among them were a few of the gravediggers, bricklayers, and others who were supposed to be helping with Jia Genbo and Ding Xiaozu's funerals. Although my father was gratified by all the attention, he didn't want to be thought rude for stealing people away from Genbo and Yuju's funerals. "Hey, you there!" he shouted. "Why don't you go and help Genbo and Yuju's families? They'd be embarrassed if no one showed up." "We dug their graves first," answered one man, "so it's only fair that these two get buried first." Grandpa was also uncomfortable with the situation. "I don't know," he said. "That doesn't seem right, does it?" Ding Yujin's mother piped up. "Oh, I don't mind if these kids get buried first. After all, we're one big family, right?" "Exactly," said Jia Genzu's wife. We're all friends and neighbors here. What does it matter who gets buried first? And so it was that Gembo and Juzu's funerals were pushed aside, temporarily forgotten, as the whole village pitched in to help bury Uncle and Lingling. Uncle and Lingling's funeral was very well attended. A crowd of nearly 200 mourners watched as their coffins were placed in the burial chamber and the entrance sealed with brick. My father had paid for a fancy tombstone, an imposing granite monument with the following inscription: "Here lie Ding Liang and Zia Lingling, star-crossed butterfly lovers." When the monument was raised, the crowd broke into applause as loud as spring thunder, the thunderclap that heralds the passage of winter and the coming of spring, the rumbling that can be heard when the insects awake and the sleeping dragon raises its head.